Now, this title that we have here, of course, is taken from Revelation 16 and verse 17, where the seventh vial is introduced in these, as we've alluded to before, in these last 5 verses of Revelation and chapter 16. Now that poses a question. Here we are in Revelation 16, and what we've got is we've got the 7 vials. So the first 5 vials, Napoleon's career over 30 years, charging around Europe. We've got the 6th vial, the drying up of the river Euphrates. And now we've got 5 verses which introduce us to this 40-year period from Armageddon to the beginning of the Millennium. This third great earthquake. Question. The statement first. Chapter 14 is all about this 7th vial. Chapter 14 has got all this detail about this third great earthquake. Well, if chapter 14 gives us all this detail, why do we have to wait for a couple of more chapters, chapter 16, before it is introduced, the 7th? Why does chapter 14, full of detail, come before the introduction here in chapter 16? I want to just show you very briefly why that is so as part of our study this afternoon. So what we're going to do, having already looked at 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15, we're going to, in our studies now, we're going to be focusing on this, 7th vial, this 40-year period. Now, brothers and sisters, the outline of our study, we're going to be having a look at the structure, the overall structure of the apocalypse, positioning the 7th vial and answering that question, why does chapter 14 come before it is introduced in chapter 16? We also want to have a look at this expression, pouring the vial into the air. What does that mean? Can we justify and prove what our understanding of that is? And looking at these hailstones. And we're going to finish on an exhortational note with respect to these hailstones. And then what we're going to be doing through the course of our session this afternoon is doing some links between chapter 16 and chapter 14. And those of you who were at the Bible school, we linked it, but we're not going to be doing the same links. We're going to actually go even further and show you some astounding linkages between the 16th and the 14th chapter. All right, question asked. Chapter 14, the detail of the 7th vial. Why is it there? Why do we have to wait 2 more chapters before it's introduced to us, what we've already read in detail 2 chapters prior? Well, brothers and sisters, here's the overall structure. Some of you have seen this many, many times. Some may be new to it. Here we have the 7th vial there. That is our 40-year period. There is the third great earthquake, the vintage of the earth and the mid-heaven proclamation bound up in that 7th vial. Now, here's the answer to the question. Chapter 14 is here. So is chapter 12. So is chapter 13. So is chapter 15. In between the 6th trumpet and the 7th trumpet. All right, now let's start our little journey by just doing this. Here we are, and the 7th seal is open. The 7th seal is open. It opens in chapter 8, verse 1, and the 7th seal goes right through to the beginning of the millennium. Now, you know, when you go to chapter 8 and verse 1, some of you have been here, we've taken you a few times here. In chapter 8 and verse 1 is Constantine, who is now the ruling emperor of the world. And in chapter 8 and verse 1, we're AD 324. Constantine has been He's been the emperor of the West. He's beaten his brother-in-law Licinius over in the East. He is now the ruler of the world. And the world is now no longer pagan. The world is Christian. Now God is going to bring judgment on the Christian Roman world through these 6 trumpets to start with. And what happens, brothers and sisters and young people, is God is going to judge the Christian Roman world through trumpets 1 through 4 And by bringing the 4 German barbarians across the Danube and the Rhine, so in trumpets 1, 2, 3, and 4, God is going to lop off 1/3 of the Christian Roman world, the Latin West. Then God is going to use the Saracens in trumpet 5 to lop off the Hellenized portion of the Christian Roman world. And then God is going to bring the Turks in the first part of the 6th trumpet. God is going to bring the Turks to lop off the remaining 1/3 of the Christian Roman world. Now, we said the first part of the 6th trumpet at the end of chapter 9 are the Turks coming in. The first part of the 6th trumpet, well, the 6th trumpet is divided into 2 bits. So the first part of the 6th trumpet in chapter 9, in come the Turks. And then God goes, whoof, splits the 6th trumpet, and God gives John a vision of his work in the 7th vial in chapter 10. And then after you read the end of chapter 10, the second part of the 6th trumpet takes us through chapter 11. All right, having said that, now let's go to chapter 11. We're going to answer the question, how come chapter 14 is before chapter 16? Here we are, we're in chapter 11 of the Apocalypse, and the 6th trumpet, the second part of the 6th trumpet, has been outworked through chapter 11. French Revolution, Second Great Earthquake. And you know, you get to verse 14. And in verse 14 of chapter 11, we have these words, the second woe is past. The second woe, the 6th trumpet. You all know, don't you? The woe trumpets, woe trumpet 1, woe trumpet 2, woe trumpet 3. The second woe is past, verse 14. And behold, the third woe, the 7th trumpet, comes quickly. Now, some of you have written this in your margins. Some of you have it in your margins. When you read verse 14 of chapter 11, the second woe was past, the 6th trumpet, and behold, the 7th trumpet's coming. To follow the chronology of the story, you would then go to chapter 16, which contain 7 vials. So you go from verse 14 of chapter 11, chronologically following the history story, you then jump into chapter 16 and continue the story. Question, why is chapter 12, chapter 13, chapter 14 and chapter 15 in the way? If I'm going to go from verse 14, chapter 11, following the chronology and pick up the detail in chapter 6, why are these 4 chapters in the way? Well, here's one answer. When you read through chapter 11, John sees for the first time the beast. Verse 7, chapter 11. Not worrying about when they have finished their testimony. That's not our brief. The beast that ascendeth out of the abyss. John, all the way through the Apocalypse, up until this time, has not seen the beast. So God says, John, we need to let you know how awful this monster is, how powerful this monster is. And by the way, John, we need to take you back in time so you see the development of this beast. And by the way, you will not understand the temple and the holy city and the altar being trodden down for 42 months in the first 2 verses. You won't understand that unless you've got chapter 13. And by the way, John, you're not going to understand the 2 witnesses witnessing for 1,260 days unless you've got chapter 12. So John's not going to understand this stuff, nor are we. John, who's the beast? No idea. Right, let's go back from the context of 1789 and the French Revolution in chapter 11. John, let's go way back and see the beast. So he's given chapter 12 and chapter 13, the dragon, the sea beast, the earth beast, the image of the beast. And when John gets to the end of chapter 13, he's left with a monster with a number, 666. And John would have said at the end of reading through chapter 12 and chapter 13, he would go, this monster is absolutely impregnable. You can't get rid of it. God says, yes. The end of chapter 13, he is left with this impression of this monster with a number 666. And God says, John, this monster with the number is going to be beaten by another creature who has a number. And this creature is a little lamb. That's why chapter 14 is there. Verse 1, and I looked and a lamb. So he goes from this monster with a 666 to a little lamb with 144. That's why chapter 14 is there, brothers and sisters, to show the way this creature, this monster of chapter 12 and chapter 13, which he had to know about. That's why chapter 14 is there to show John unequivocally this monster will be beaten in the 7th vial. That's why chapter 14 is there. That's why chapter 12 is there. That's why chapter 13 is there. And then when you come over to chapter 15, you go, okay, chapter 15, smallest chapter in the Apocalypse, only 8 verses. Well, why is that there? Before we jump into chapter 16. And why chapter 15 there is, brothers and sisters and young people, is to show we've been doing history, the barbarians, the Saracens, the Turks, the things that happened in France with the French. It's all about history. It's all about history. And we're going to now launch into Napoleon in chapter 16, all about history. And God says, just so you understand that the Apocalypse is more than history, I'm giving you 8 verses in chapter 15 that shows you the Apocalypse is more than just history. Be involved in the work of the scroll. So, chronologically, from chapter 11, verse 14, we go into chapter 16. And 12, 13, 14, and 15 are placed there for very good reasons. So I hope that sort of makes a little sense as to why those 4 are there. Perhaps a little bit of a discussion with some of you later over a meal. All with us? You focused? Let me have a look. All good? Could you repeat that, what we just said about why chapter 12, 13, 14 and 15 are there? We won't break you into groups and get you to discuss that, but I'll ask you the questions, especially the young ones who've got very quick minds. I'll ask you after. Okay? No, I won't, because then you'll be thinking about that and nothing else while the rest of the study goes on. So I'm not going to ask you any questions at all. All right? So just follow me and forget what I just said. All right, brothers and sisters. So there it is. Chapters 12 through 15 are between chapter 11, verse 14, as we then spill into chapter 16 and the details of these vials. All righty, that having been said, we now turn our attention to these last 5 verses of Revelation 16, which is the summary with some detail about that 40-year period. And what we have here is that these 40 years, albeit just compressed into 5 verses, if you want the detail of these 5 verses, there are the cross-references. In Revelation 10, verses 2 to 3, Revelation 14, pretty much the whole chapter, Revelation 17, verse 14, all of chapter 18, all of chapter 19, and the first 3 verses of chapter 20 are all the detail that is compressed into these 5 verses in Revelation chapter 16. Now, if you want a copy of these slides later on, you're more than welcome to have a copy of those if you want to Bible mark those references to pick that detail up at a later stage. All right, brothers and sisters, this expression at the end of verse 17. Verse 17. And the 7th angel poured out his bowl. You and me, we are the 7th vial angel. We poured our bowl into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven from the throne saying, "It is done." That expression, "it is done," is our cry at the end of this 40 years. It's done. Our work bringing this world to heal right on the cusp of the beginning of the millennium. That is the cry you and I are going to make. Now, if you want to cross-reference and you want a little link here, that expression, "it is done," could actually be written at the end of Revelation 14. So we come to Revelation 14 as a link, and at the end of Revelation 14, which is that 40-year period, Revelation 14. At the end of this, we have that expression about blood coming up to the horse bridles in verse 20. And the winepress was trodden without the city, and blood came out of the winepress, even under the horse bridles, by the space of 1,600. It is done. That is what you could put at the end of chapter 14. because that is an exact link to verse 17 of Revelation and chapter 16. All right, having said that, brothers and sisters, young people, this expression in Revelation and chapter 16, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven. Now we make that statement. This is the voice of you and me. This is the voice of the saints who are now in political power, enthroned in Jerusalem. That is the voice that comes out of the temple in heaven, in Jerusalem. We have political power post-Armageddon. But we need to prove that. We need to be able to have a note in our margins to prove that this is, in fact, you and me with a cry that goes out from Jerusalem. And we can do that, brothers and sisters, by looking at this. Let's go now and do this little connection, another little connecting link between chapter 16 and chapter 14. I want you to come with me, if you will, to chapter 14 and verse 17. A voice out of the temple in heaven. How can we prove this is the saints from Jerusalem? Well, if we have a look at chapter 14, and there's chapter 14 there, all right? So 10 years and 30 years. Go back to chapter 16, 40 years and that 5 verses. Okay, back to chapter 14. So we're talking about that period between Armageddon and the beginning of the millennium. Now, a voice went out of the temple in heaven. Look at this. In chapter 14 and verse 15, we have an angel who comes out of the temple, not the temple in heaven. This angel, you and me, the saints, we come out of the temple. Well, we know that the temple is, in fact, a symbol of the brothers and sisters in Christ. 2 Corinthians 6, verse 16, 1 Peter 2 and verse 5. So here are the saints, but they're not in heaven. They're not in political rulership or political authority. But you might say, hang on, verse 1 of chapter 14, we're on Mount Zion. We're on Mount Zion. This is post-Armageddon. What do you mean the saints are not yet in Jerusalem in political power? Well, look at this, brothers and sisters and young people. There's the temple. And when you come to verse 17, another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven. What do we make of this? Well, this section here in verses 14 through 16 is before Armageddon. It is not in chronological order, because that section that we've coloured in there in orange, verses 14 through 16, that is Armageddon. That is the harvest of the earth. Joel 3 tells us that. So here we are. This is you and me coming from Sinai as we come into Jerusalem and the battle of Armageddon. Therefore, verses 14 through 16 is you and me not yet ensconced in Jerusalem in political power. So what we need to do to get the chronology right in this chapter is we need to go, verses 14 through 16 belong before verse 1 of chapter 14. The temple, not yet in Jerusalem. So verses 14 through 16 is prior to us, 144,000 with the Lamb standing on Mount Zion. And then we come into verses 17 through 20, where we reap the vintage of the earth, where judgment is effected on Catholic Europe. We are now the temple in heaven. Now, a little connection link. If you then connect that heaven there in verse 17 with that heaven there in verse 2, it is exactly the same. We in verse 17, we in verse 2 are in political authority post-Armageddon. Good little colouring exercise to do that. And again, I said you may very, very welcome to have these slides if you so desire a little. Okay, let's just finish off that proof with a couple of very interesting little quotations. So this political heaven, this the saints ruling in Jerusalem, you pick that up not only in Revelation 16 verse 21, but in those other quotes. Let's come back, brothers and sisters, to Revelation 16 and verse 21. This is the saints in political power and authority. Verse 21, Revelation 16. And there fell upon men a great hail out of Jerusalem. You and I are going to go after Armageddon and bring judgment for those 40 years. Great hail, the third great earthquake. So out of heaven means we emerge with political authority from Jerusalem. We have the same thing in Revelation 18 and verse 20. So in Revelation 18 and verse 20, rejoice over her, thou heaven, the newly formed government established by Christ and them in Jerusalem. Verse 20 of Revelation and 18. And finally, brothers and sisters, at the end of the millennium, in Revelation in chapter 20 and verse 9, and they went up on the breadth of the earth and compassed the camp of the saints about and the beloved city, and fire came down from God out of the government of Christ in Jerusalem. So each one of those three quotations, coupled with those two in Revelation 14, are talking about you and me immortalised with our Lord Jesus Christ in power and authority. All right. Now, picking up this little statement, and the seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air. Now, you might have written in your margins, the political firmament or the heaven of the world. Has anybody got that in their margin? The political firmament or the heaven of the world? Sort of, yes? No? Yes? Okay. You may or may not have it, but if you have, how do you prove it? How do you prove that this air is talking about the firmament or the heaven, the ruling powers of the world? We're going to bring judgment on the ruling powers of the world after Armageddon and before the millennium begins. Well, let's have a look at this idea of air, firmament, and heaven. Now, three quotations, two from the Gospels and one from Genesis 1. Just building up this little folio of evidence. In Matthew 13, which we won't turn, time being the enemy, Matthew 13 and verse 32, Jesus talked about the seed, the little seed that grew into a great tree, and the birds of the air nestled in the branches. In Luke 13 and verse 19, the Lord uses the expression, the fowls of the air. So you've got birds, fowls, flying in the air. When you come to Genesis 1 and verses 6 through 8 and verse 20, you have the fowl that might fly in the open firmament of heaven. So you've got this idea of the fowls flying in the open firmament or the air or the heaven. You might think, not so sure that you can connect it like that. Well, let's just have a look at a couple of quotations out of Ephesians. And in Ephesians, we get this idea of this political firmament between the waters above and the waters beneath. What do we mean? Well, Ephesians 2 and verse 2 and Ephesians 6 and verse 12. Now, I'm going to put Ephesians 2 and verse 2 up on the screen. So here are the birds flying in the air. They're flying in the firmament. They're flying in the heaven. And this voice is going to go out from the political heaven, but here judgment is going to be poured into the political firmament of the then world. And look at Ephesians 2 and verse 2. You might like to turn that up. I said, we'll put it on the screen, but let's have a look at that, brothers and sisters and young people. Might want to make a note or two in Ephesians chapter 2. How did we go? Did we have a coffee? Do we have time to have a coffee in that break? There was no refreshments offered. Did you get a glass of water? You got nothing. Well, I'm a bit frightened to drink my water now because you'll be coveting it. So I'll hide it behind here. Now, Ephesians chapter 2, and let's have a look at this idea of, what's this firmament? We're going to pour the judgments of God into the air. Well, Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 2. Let's read verse 2 from the Authorised Version. Paul says, wherein at times past you walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience. So Paul is saying you were under the sway and the tendency of this present age. You were under the rule according to the ruling or the prince of the authority of the air. What does that mean in simpler language? The chief authority of the air or heaven that Paul's talking about is sin. Well, you read of that in verse 1. And you hath he quickened, and who were dead in trespasses and sins. So what Paul is saying here, brothers and sisters and young people, he's saying that you, before you came to the truth, you walked according to the spirit that works in the disobedient, the flesh. When you therefore go to Ephesians 6 and verse 12, we have this emphasised for us. Remember, we're just thinking, what are we going to pour our judgments upon? Whom are we going to pour our judgments upon when the vial goes into the air? Well, Ephesians 6 and verse 12. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. So what Paul is saying? The rulers of the darkness of this world, literally the world rulers of this darkness. In other words, the world rulers of this prevailing ignorance and sin. Now, you want to summarise all of this, brothers and sisters, of what we've just said? Look at what Brother Thomas says in Help Us Israel and page 97. It just crystallises these verses. The fowls, the birds of the air, Genesis 1, the firmament, the heaven, and all Paul says in Ephesians 2 and Ephesians 6, Brother Thomas says this. Now, sin in its sovereign manifestations among the nations executes its will and pleasure through the civil and ecclesiastical authorities of the state. What, then, is decreed by emperors, kings, popes, and subordinate rulers are the mandates of the prince of the world, who works in them all to gratify their own lusts, oppress the people, and make war against the saint. They make war against the saint through sin. That's the driving power of the rulers of this world. They make war against the saint. And in Revelation 16, we will make war against them and bring them to naught, which is our purpose in this seventh vial. So we're going to pour our vial into the political arena who are energised and motivated by sin. Now, brothers and sisters, we're going well. Almost drawing, don't get too excited, we're not finished just yet, but we're almost drawing our thoughts together. Now, when we come and look at this last little section here, it's quite an amazing little statement. And there fell upon men, they're going to, Brother Thomas says, they, through their sin, make war against the saints in all their ecclesiastical powers, which they've done for thousands of years. One day we're going to bring these hailstones upon them. And here it is, verse 21 of Revelation 16. And there fell upon the air, motivated and driven by sin, a very great hail out of heaven, out of Jerusalem. Every stone about the weight of a talent. And men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail. Now, I want to just look at this word hail and why it's there and what we're being told, and then have a look at this little expression as we draw our study to a conclusion about the weight of a talent. All right. And when we look at this word hail, brothers and sisters and young people, the word hail is used only 4 times in the New Testament. And they're all here in Revelation. The word hail is first used in Revelation 8 and verse 7. Now, brothers and sisters and young people, listen to this. Revelation 8 and verse 7, the first wind trumpet. And this first wind trumpet is blown, and Alaric and his mob of Visigoths sweep down. Alaric and his Visigoths. And when you read Revelation 8 and verse 7, there was great hail. And when you read Revelation, we better look at it, because if you want to jot a little note down there, Revelation 8 and verse 7, the first wind trumpet, this is the Visigoths under their leader Alaric or Alaric. So in Revelation 8 and verse 7, this is the first time the word hail is used in verse 7. And there it is. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail. And this is when Alaric in 410 AD came to Rome, and this was the first time in 800 years when the queen of the world had barbarians banging on her gates. And there was Alaric, and he circled Rome and stood there and said, I'm not leaving. What happened to Jerusalem in AD 70 is now happening to Rome through Alaric. And you know, Alaric saw himself, he was an Arian Christian. He didn't believe in the Trinity. Alaric, this German barbarian, was an Arian Christian. And you know what he said? It is not me that doeth this, but there is one who drives me on, bidding me spoil Rome. That's exactly what he said. I'm not doing this. I'm conquering Rome, but there's one who drives me on. He saw himself as an instrument by God, would you believe? And so the first time we read about hail, it is judgment on Christian Rome. And the next time we read about it is in Revelation 11 and verse 19, judgment on Christian Rome. And the last 2 times it's used, it's judgment on Catholic Europe. So every time you read the word hail, the context is Rome, 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 finally gone. First conquered by Alaric, who saw himself as an instrument of God. And we, brothers and sisters, will finally, completely, utterly obliterate that horrible system. Well, we're told, we won't do that because I'm conscious of the time. We're told, brothers and sisters, that these hailstones are about the weight of a talent. Now, this word talent as an adjective, this is the only place in the New Testament where this word is used. So what's God saying? You and me are hailstones. You and me are going to bring this devastation upon this system that has so mocked God and tormented the brothers and sisters for years. But it says we're going to be about the weight of a talent. Now, if you wanted to literally imagine what that was, well, the weight of a talent is actually about the weight of a small fridge. I mean, I've seen hailstones in Australia that are probably the size of cricket balls, and I've seen the devastation that they do. But could you imagine a hailstone, the weight of a small fridge? Ooh, no one. You might get your car dented with those ones. You might get your caravan dented. The weight of a small fridge. But you know, brothers and sisters, there's a lesson here for us. Each one of us are the hailstone. The word talent, that is the only place that it is used as an adjective. But from the noun, this word talent is used 15 times in the New Testament. 14 of them are in Matthew 25. Now, I want to bring our study to an exhortation and take you to Matthew 25. We are the individual hailstones of Revelation 16. What's that got to do with the parable of the talents? Well, we go to Matthew 25, and there we have those 14 occasions of the word talent used of the 15 occasions in the New Testament. Now, brothers and sisters, when you come to Matthew 25, you read these words. What are these talents? What's this got to do with you and me, immortalised, coming out of Jerusalem and bringing devastation on the sin-motivated powers of this world? Well, verse 14. For the kingdom of heaven is as a man travelling into a far country who called his own servants and delivered. Now, I'm going to highlight that because that is oh so important. When we come to Matthew 25, for the kingdom of heaven is as a man travelling into a far country who called his own servants and delivered unto them his goods. These talents are not ours. These talents are his. We pick that up, don't we, when we look at verse 18. This is the Lord's money. We pick that up in verse 25. Your talent, all that is yours. We pick it up in verse 27. You ought therefore to have put my money to the exchanges, that when I come, I should receive mine. So these talents are a gift from Jesus Christ. These talents are a gift from God. They are the word. The talents are the word of God. Now, it was only the 5-talent person and the 2-talent person that understood the principle of God manifestation, God likeness in this parable. Because you can see, brothers and sisters and young people, this is what happened. Jesus said, I've delivered this to you. And the 5-talent person said, I understand God manifestation. And the 2-talent person listens and said, I understand God manifestation. What are we talking about, brothers and sisters and young people? Look at this. Delivered. We understand the meaning of that word by Paul's use in Romans 6 and verse 17. But God be thanked that you were servants of sin, but you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered you. No, brothers and sisters, no. In the Greek, you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine whereunto you were delivered. There's the Bible. You and me have been poured into the Bible. And when Jesus Christ comes back, he wants to lift you out of the Bible and see the Bible, the Word. He wants to see an exact replica. So that's the expression. You have been delivered to the Word. You have been poured into it. Take the same shape. Do you reckon the 5-talent person understood that? Oh, yeah. Because when you read in verse 20, the 5-talent person said, and so he that had received 5 talents came and bought other 5 talents, saying, now listen to his words, Lord, thou. God-centered. Lord, thou. And then he uses the expression, you delivered me. You, my mind is on you, and you delivered me to your word. Here is an exact replica of what you delivered me to. Here's the mould, the Bible, and here is the shape that I've taken. He understood God manifestation. He was a hailstone to be. And then you have, brothers and sisters, the same with the 2-talent person. He also that had received 2 talents came and said, Lord, thou. His mind is on God. You are first. You delivered unto me. He understood the principle of being poured into the Bible. And therefore, he showed an exact replica. I gave you 2, you've mirrored it. I gave you 5, you've mirrored it. But the 1-talent person, brothers and sisters, oh dear, it's not Lord, thou, it is Lord, I. It's all about me. I. No wonder he could not mirror. He didn't use the word delivered. He didn't understand the fact that he'd been poured into the Bible. No understanding of God manifestation. Lord, I. And then he tries to mock his his statement by saying, "Oh, I knew you," but he did not. What an amazing thing, brothers and sisters. So therefore, this man, focusing on himself, is unable to give just one back, because God, Jesus Christ, is looking for an exact replica of the talents to which he had delivered unto those men. And therefore, for him, there was fear. And for those who understood God manifestation, there is joy. It is a joyful thing, brothers and sisters and young people, a joyful thing to be poured into the Bible and to see a mirror image of the Lord's goods. And if we do that, then we will, God willing, very soon, brothers and sisters, be part of that seventh vial angel who will pour our judgments. It will be a joy. This joy hath all the saints, to rid the world of sin and to have the world give glory unto the God of heaven. Thank you, brothers and sisters and young people.